Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to those of you joining us from the US. Good morning. For those of us in London, good evening almost. It's certainly dark enough to call it evening. I am Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the US and Americas program here at Chatham House. It is an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to see so many people logging on for what will be undoubtedly a rigorous, important, and relevant discussion at a time when I know so many of you are preparing to see your friends, your families, to travel locally, nationally, and around the world. And I know that our speakers are included in that sort of level of relevance, but also urgency, presumably for a quiet period, or maybe not so quiet a period. We are here today um, to talk about a very special discussion of U.S. national security policy, what to expect in the first 100 days of the next administration. We have two terrific speakers, both, I think, very well known to anybody who follows U.S. foreign policy debates closely, especially those that are taking place in the Republican Party. But also to those of you in London, you will know Corey Shockey very well. I'm going to introduce them both briefly, say a few words about our event today, which is on the record and is being recorded. Please note that. If you choose to ask a question, you are being recorded. And I have no doubt, given the caliber of the speakers, that people will listen to your questions. Corey Shockey is a friend of Chatham House. She lived in London for 2 years as the deputy director at International Institute for Strategic Studies. She has engaged with us extensively over the years as a speaker, as a friend, as many things. She is currently a senior fellow and director of foreign and defense policy studies at the American Enterprise Institute. She lives in Washington, but hails from California. She has taught across many of America's leading research universities, including especially Stanford University. She has worked in the State Department, the Defense Department, and on the National Security Council across more than one administration. She has authored many books. I'm going to mention my favorite, Safe Passage: Transition from British to American Hegemony, published in 2017. It's my favorite because it's rich, full of history, and has some extremely important lessons that we can draw from. If you haven't read it already, it's a great Christmas present for your colleagues and friends, or a holiday gift. Dan Caldwell is public policy advisor at Defense Priorities. He was previously the vice president for foreign policy at Stand Together. He is also a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. He served from 2005 to 2009, including in Iraq during the war. And both Dan and Corey have written very important articles staking out their view of an optimal, I think it's safe to say, the optimal path forward for the Republican Party for Donald Trump when he enters office after January 20th. And I think it published in Foreign Affairs, both of them, and both published since the November 5th election, with very relevant pieces. I refer you to them. And I chose the two of you to speak not only because you are so well written and spoken, but also because you represent two very different views of the optimal way forward for foreign policy in this next period of America's foreign relations. Um, it is safe to say, I believe, and maybe you'll disagree, that Donald Trump's nominees so far do not give us clarity entirely on which of these perspectives is dominant across what's likely to be a future senior foreign policy team. Although I know, Dan, you might disagree with that based on some things you said in your Foreign Affairs article about Rubio's transformation or transition of his basic foreign policy beliefs. But I will sum up maybe by saying that Corey Shockey, you talked about the need for deterrence and the need for increasing defense spending, deterrence being absolutely critical to America's success in its future foreign policy. And Dan Caldwell, you talked about the importance of realism and restraint. Now, those are big terms. They're quite different. Corey Shockey, I'm going to come to you first because you spent the most time in London. You know our audience as well. Please tell us your perspective. What does it mean, deterrence and defense? What do you hope to see out of this next 4 years, both generally and on the concrete issues that Europeans and those of us in the UK are very worried about and concerned about: Ukraine, Russia, the Middle East, and China?
So I think the challenge for Americans is to appreciate what voters chose in the election, both the presidential election and in who they've returned or emboldened into Congress, and try and find ways to match that with opportunities the Biden administration missed, things the Biden administration did badly, ways that we can help the new administration be successful. And in the foreign affairs piece, there were two that I think are overwhelmingly important. And the first is to reestablish deterrence. The Biden administration has been so anxious about preventing obligations by the United States, whether it is fearfulness of escalation in the war in Ukraine, or ending the commitment to Afghanistan, that they have projected to America's adversaries our fears rather than projecting onto those adversaries the things they should be worried about. Because in fact, the United States is much stronger than our adversaries are. And yet we are handing them the opportunity to constrain our choices. So that's the first thing that I think is important, and that I have confidence a Trump administration is well positioned to enact. And the second is the urgent need to rebuild American military strength. You know, the Chinese economy has 235 times the shipbuilding capacity that the United States does. And that is not an equation that will keep America safe. And so I think the administration, the Biden administration, actually across all 4 years has failed to keep pace in defense spending with inflation. So we are losing ground, not gaining ground, even when the administration acknowledges the need to gain ground. And Congress, in one of its last acts, the good news is Congress just is poised to pass the National Defense Authorization Act for the 60th time running. It is the only legislation Congress reliably passes. And the bipartisan work of Democrats and Republicans to get it passed is a model for the return to regular order of Congress. Every day that Congress operates, has the government operating under a continuing resolution, costs the Department of Defense $300 million in lost purchasing power. That's terrible and should be fixed. But in order to get that bipartisan agreement, in order to get the votes to pass the NDAA, the Senate had to consent to the House of Representatives deal with President Biden on what the top line, the overall budget, should be. And again, for the 4th year running, that does not even keep pace with inflation for the Department of Defense. That needs to be fixed. I think the Trump administration, because they keep emphasizing peace through strength and the deficiencies of defense spending in the Biden administration. I think they're well positioned to remedy both of those deficiencies that the Biden administration has brought for American national security.
Let me ask you one follow-up question on this before I come to you, Dan. You mentioned also, I think I'm not sure you said it now, but you mentioned in your article that the U.S. is about 3% of GDP on spending. There's a certain irony there that, we expect Donald Trump to ask Europe for at least 3%, America's NATO allies. If not, we're now hearing 3.5. Some people have said 5%. Could you say a little bit, spending is a very generic thing. You mentioned the Chinese numbers on shipbuilding. If you were going to, drill down on that, what is it that you think needs to be done? What should the priorities be on defense spending in order to reestablish deterrence? I know they're not exactly the same thing, but the defense spending is presumably there to contribute to America's abilities to deter its adversaries.
Sure. So, in the American context, first of all, you're right about the irony of America with its global interests and commitments only spending 3.2% of GDP. And at the growth rate of the American economy, that proportion is going to diminish. So we are likely to be pressing European allies to spend a greater percentage of GDP than we are spending. That said, uh, the biggest upheaval, the biggest threat to security is actually to the countries that are America's allies in Europe. And so I think it's actually not unreasonable to say when Russia has invaded your neighbors, that should be an alarm bell that should rocket your defense spending up. Um, the two things that I would prioritize in reestablishing deterrence for the US, first and foremost, it's replenishing our weapons and munitions capabilities. And that's going to require investment in the defense industrial base. Most NATO countries, including the US, have only about 5 days of stockpiles at high intensity combat. That is a temptation to our enemies to challenge us now before we can fix the problem. And there is no, God-given right for us to have the time to repair these problems or to win wars that we fight. And so that would be my top priority. Even if we stop giving weapons to Ukraine, which I very much hope we will not do, we would still have empty cupboards for ourselves. So that's the first priority. The second priority is rebuilding both the capacity and capability of the United States Navy. The Pacific Ocean's a great big expanse of water, and we are the people who are going to have to get across it to defend Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, other countries, some of whom are allies, others of whom are countries that we just care about their ability to remain free and prosperous. And demonstrating that we have the ability to hopscotch across the Pacific and defend our friends is the cheapest way to prevent us having to actually do so.
Quick question, and then on to you. Corey, how hopeful are you that your recommendations will be accepted? Just even a brief answer would be great. On those, how hopeful are you that your recommendations will be accepted by the next administration and Congress?
Well, I think they are consistent with what the president himself has said on the campaign trail. And so, despite my poor record of my recommendations becoming Republican policies, I'd guess, I don't know, 6 and 10.
Good. 6 and 10 is better than 50-50. That's an optimistic outlook. Dan Caldwell, you have done some tremendous research, writing, supporting of people across multiple institutions to really foster deep thinking and policy analysis. And I think it's safe to say advocacy on what it means to have a US policy of restraint. Can you tell us what that means to you. Please take the opportunity to respond to Kori Schake. And if you could, give us your perspective on what you think the Trump administration should be thinking about as its priorities for U.S. National security policy over the next 4 years. And again, thank you so much for doing this. I know you're under a lot of
Well,
constraint.
I greatly appreciate you having me here today and inviting me. I'm also just honored to be on this panel with Dr. Schake. We obviously have some pretty vehement disagreements around America's role in the world, but I've always found her respectful and willing to engage with my side of the debate, and so I'm appreciative of that as well too. I also just want to say, just up front, I want to make clear that I am speaking for myself. I'm speaking in my capacity as a public policy advisor at Defense Priorities. I am no way speaking for the Trump transition, the Trump campaign, and certainly not for President Trump himself. So I just want to make that absolutely clear. Now, to get to the question, so I just want to say up front is that just with a lot of things, when you're talking about ideology in American politics, words have different meanings for different people. The term conservative, for example, I used to joke that I'm, a Nasserite, because the word conservative didn't mean it means so many different things to so many different people. It was confusing. But so when I use the terms realism and restraint, which people like Mike Pompeo were using at the end of the first Trump administration, I think Secretary of State Pompeo had a different understanding of what that meant than I did. For me, essentially, it's important that the realism comes first before the restraint. And so essentially adopting the view that America exists in a world that is defined by nations constantly vying for power, and the balances of power are shifting between nations, and recognizing that we as the United States have limited ability to shape that. And that as a result, we should primarily prioritize our national interests. That's obviously very simplistic term. Now, I put realism first because of that key recognition that things are constantly shifting. And there are times in American history, mainly the Cold War, where the United States needed to take a more aggressive forward-leading posture, particularly because of the threat posed by Soviet communism and the global threat that posed. But because of the changing nature of the world, because of the fact that America exists, it has weak neighbors. We are surrounded by two oceans, and the stopping power of water is real. That because of the nature of the world, and also because of our severe constraints on our power right now, that we are able to, and it is wise for us to pursue a more restrained foreign policy, meaning that we need to be judicious in our use of power, particularly our military power. And I actually want to spend a minute talking about the constraints. And actually, Kori alluded to some of them, and I think she actually articulated some of them well. So we exist in a world right now where I think since the end of ever since the end of the Cold War, our power in a financial sense, in a military sense, and an industrial sense is severely constrained. We have a $35 trillion national debt. We're getting to a norm where it's normal for us to run a $1 trillion to $2 trillion a year deficit. We have continuing persistent high levels of inflation. It's lowered the last year or so, but it's still higher than it was in the previous 30 years or so. Some of that is likely caused by our high levels of deficit spending and national debt. It's also worth noting that our military, and I do agree with Kori that our military, particularly our Navy, is in deep trouble, and that's in large part due to the fact it's been worn down by 20 years of fighting primarily brush fire conflicts in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, but also North Africa, mainly in conflicts that just simply were not in our interest, and were kind of in pursuit of trying to create these liberal democracies in a top-down manner. In addition, we've had failed acquisition program after failed acquisition program. And despite the fact we were able to meet recruiting goals this year, long term, we are facing a recruiting and manning crisis, and that creates challenges in both expanding the size of our force, but also manning our current military force, in particular our Army. And then Corey talked about this as well too. Our constraints on our industrial power. We have really struggled the last few years to meet goals that have been set by the Defense Department and the Biden administration to meet increased production quotas around things like artillery shells, Patriot missiles, and things like that. And that's due to some systemic issues within the American economy and American society as a whole that are very, very hard to overcome, mainly labor shortages, supply chain challenges. There was, for example, in 2022 and 2023, a shortage of ball bearings because we were trying to scale up certain productions and, then all of certain systems. And all of a sudden, the Navy had a hard time getting a hold of certain things, even though those were systems we weren't sending over to Ukraine. And so we have really struggled to ramp up. And yes, more money would solve some things on the margins, but these are long-term systemic issues that are going to take a very, very long time to fix. Again, Corey laid out very effectively. I agree that our munition stockpiles are depleted largely because of our large-scale support of Ukraine, but also our partners in the Middle East. And again, that's going to be very hard to fix while also trying to continue to support Ukraine, our partners in the Middle East, and then hardening Taiwan to deter a Chinese invasion. So taking all that together, I said before the election, I'll say now, that whoever was going to be the 47th president in their first 100 days was going to deal with a world that was much different, even than when President Biden took office in 2021, and then when President Trump took office in 2017. And so with those constraints in mind, I think we really have no choice but to start to stop doing or do less of certain things, and then prioritize the most important things to American national security. That's primarily around the home front, but also I believe in the Pacific. And I fundamentally believe that American foreign policy these days, the debate really comes down to a math problem. And it's essentially one of not what we should do, but what we can do. And that's not an excuse to say that we shouldn't work to solve some of these longer term challenges. But the short term and medium term reality is that we have very limited resources. Political will can be overcome and change some of these other constraints I talked about, but the political will and the political dynamic, which I talk a lot about in my foreign affairs piece, is also something that should be acknowledged. Just quickly on the spending front, Corey, I agree that long-term entitlements need to be fixed. But the reality is the political will is not there for that. The political will, unfortunately, isn't even there for larger discretionary spending cuts, which I believe need to happen as well too. And so that really constrains us to get to the level of defense spending that I think we would need if I thought, I don't believe this, if I thought primacy was the foreign policy we should pursue. Now, getting again to how is the incoming administration going to deal with it? Just 3 points I'd like to make. So first off, I just have to say to your audience, believe absolutely nothing of what you hear in the media about what President Trump is going to do and who he's going to nominate until you see it come across his Truth Social or his Twitter. There have been a lot of really, really bad stories about who he's going to nominate and policies he's pursuing. And I just have to say, the American media has not exactly covered themselves in glory in covering some of this. And I thought that's important to emphasize because we have a tendency to get worked up if we see something about a certain person or policy. And so it's important to wait for the confirmation from the president himself. An example of that was around the nomination of defense secretary. There were rumors it was going to be Congressman Mike Rogers, and then you had stories that it was Tulsi Gabbard who was in the front running. And then eventually it was, my former boss, Pete Hegseth, who I've known for a while, and nobody was expecting that. So with that, caveat out of the way, I think based on what the president has said and what him and the vice president have been very clear in articulating, I think the biggest thing that they're going to really prioritize in the first 100 days, and it ties back to that constraints problem I laid out, is going to try and drive a diplomatic resolution to the war in Ukraine and start to disentangle the United States from a leading role in being the leading provider of weapons and support to Ukraine. And again, that kind of gets down to the constraints issue. I believe we can't solve some of these other problems that Corey talked about, that I talked about, unless we stop doing certain things. And we cannot continue to do what we're doing in Ukraine without creating severe problems in other parts of the world, and our ability to do things in other parts of the world and fix our force. So he's appointed General Kellogg to lead driving the diplomatic negotiation. And General Kellogg has laid out some good ideas, along with the president himself and the vice president, who I think is very articulately, as a member of the Senate, talked about the problems of our current Ukraine strategy. So I think that would be the top priority. And I think that if there isn't a resolution before the inauguration, I also think, similar to Ukraine, they want to deal with the issue of a Gaza ceasefire, because like Ukraine, that is consuming a lot of attention, a lot of also material support, considering what we're giving Israel to sustain its war. And that prevents doing other things in the Middle East, just like if you can't resolve Ukraine, there's other things you can't do. Now, the final thing I'll just say on this is, of course, world events have a tendency to disrupt the best laid plans. And there may be things happening that we can't see here or now that would disrupt those priorities and call other things to be prioritized. But again, I think the president and his team have been very clear on those two priorities and how they're going to approach it in the first 100 days.
Dan, thank you. That was very clear and very helpful. I want to ask you one question, and Corey, you might want to comment on this also. And I guess it would be good to hear your specific response to what Corey has said about deterrence. And let me give that a little bit more of an anchor. I guess my question is, and this comes out in both of your articles in different ways. The current administration, the Biden administration, has made it very clear that they don't think we can talk about the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic as two separate theaters. They see these as linked. Part of that linkage goes to the deterrence question. And Corey, you, if I read it correctly, do argue in your piece that deterring Russia is important not only for deterring Russia, it's important for deterring China. So I guess my question for you, Dan, is, what is your response to Corey and your general take on the importance of deterrence? You say in your article that there's a risk with the current strategy, I think I'm reading it correctly, in driving a spiral of insecurity and, counterproductive a security dilemma between the US and China in the region with the kind of adversarial policies that are being pursued. So what role do you think deterrence should play? And do you take issue with Corey's concrete policy recommendations for spending in order to make, in part, that part of the answer to the deterrence question is this increased defense spending?
So I do want to make clear that I think that the United States should be supporting Taiwan and our Pacific allies and partners. I do think there are more American interests at stake in the Pacific, and it is more important to our safety and economic prosperity than what is occurring in Europe. And China poses a bigger threat to the United States than Russia, in my view. And so in my mind, what I think Reed and I, my co-author, were referring to in that piece was, what we oppose, though, is things like ending strategic ambiguity, which, interestingly, President Trump has reinforced, and which President Biden all but washed away, because we think that that would lead to a situation that could spiral where the Chinese do feel compelled to take military action without actually changing the hard power equation in the Pacific. So in my view, what ultimately the assessment of the Chinese is going to make, not just against Taiwan, but other places in the Pacific, they're going to assess the hard power of both the United States and or primarily the Taiwanese and other nations in the Pacific, and their ability to actually fight and deter and raise the cost of a Chinese invasion. And I would just note too that, amphibious invasions, forced amphibious and forced airborne invasions are incredibly difficult, and they can be made very costly with a lot of cheaper, numerous weapon systems. And some of those weapon systems, which we've been actually prioritizing sending to Ukraine over Taiwan. There is I believe, close to $20 billion arms backlog with Taiwan. Now, not all of it is because of Ukraine, I want to be clear here, but there have been systems that we have delayed sending to Taiwan, and because of our support for Ukraine. And in addition as well, too, not just in Ukraine, but in the Middle East. This is something that Admiral Paparo, who is, I believe he's the commander-in-chief of the Indo-Pacific, has recently admitted. So there are, trade-offs are real. And I think the assessment going to be made is around hard power. So I think in the Biden administration, it's, in my view, been the worst of both worlds, is that you've kind of whittled away strategic ambiguity, but then you have not significantly changed the ability of some of these partners to defend themselves and ultimately deter China. So I also think too, again, the Taiwanese deserve a lot of the blame here. They have not taken their security as seriously as some of our other partners, whether it's in the Middle East, like Israel or Poland. In Eastern Europe, they're still spending about 2.5% GDP. They've been investing in the wrong types of systems. And so they deserve some of the blame too. So again, I think we've had the worst of both worlds around the Biden administration. On the defense spending question, I'm somebody who's been skeptical of increased defense spending, but even I acknowledge right now, because of the dire state, particularly of our Navy, is that some increased defense spending, particularly to repair and get our Navy back to where it needs to be, is likely required. I'll also say the Air Force. However, going back to what I mentioned earlier, is that I worry, well, not worry, there's a question of the politics, and then the financial ability to do that. We're spending significantly less than we did at the height of the Cold War on defense. Well, I mean, in the 80s, we were spending even higher in the 70s, around 9% of G, or 60s, 70s, 9% of GDP. That 6%, 5 to 6% is kind of the Reagan era defense spending level. That was at a time when our entitlement problem that I alluded to was a lot less worse. And also, too, that entitlements, I have to say, as a veteran, includes a lot of mandatory spending as a result of our wars in the Middle East, which have increased spending on veterans benefits as well, too. So for me, I don't think we can both politically and safely financially get to the level of, say, what the national, I believe is the Commission on National Defense and others propose. It just, to me, is that we can get more defense spending, but not to that number. So therefore, we need to prioritize investment in the things that are really important. And I would say is primarily the Navy and Air Force, and probably look at trade-offs against the Army.
Thank you, Dan. Let me ask you a really quick question, and I want to come to Corey on the question of Iran. Give you a moment on that, and then come to the audience. But the quick question is, do you think that America's adversaries, and I would say China, reads off of the U.S. strategy with respect to Russia? Are the theaters integrated in that sense? Does deterrence of Russia matter for China's estimation of U.S. power and strategy?
I think that in some ways they have been integrated, but not in the way I think some folks would say. I think that China wants us to continue to support Ukraine at higher levels, because it weakens our ability to do some of the things we need to do in the Pacific and to support some of our partners there. And so I think that's why they've executed this strategy where they are economically supporting Russia, but they haven't gone all the way in and supporting them, say, militarily, the same ways that North Koreans and Iranians are. And I think that they are benefiting from the continued long war in Ukraine and prolonged American involvement. And I will say, I don't view these axes of evil or aggression, whatever term is in vogue at the moment. But I do think that our foreign policy, particularly over the last 20 years or so, maybe even before that, have pushed a lot of countries together that should have diverging interests. And that's because of economic sanctions policy, because of our military policy, our policy sometimes of trying to reshape these countries through non-military means. You know, China and Russia should have diverging interests. You know, they almost fought a nuclear war. You know, a lot of that had to do with disputes over types of communism, global communism, but they've had, you know, border disputes for a long time. A Islamic fundamentalist country like Iran should have tension with Russia, considering some of Russia's problems. And again, you know, it's mostly Sunni in Russia and, you know, Shia, but whatnot. There should be tension there. And same thing with some of these other nations. We've kind of through our, what I would say, this pursuit of primacy and liberal hegemony, have pushed a lot of these countries together in a way that they naturally wouldn't cohere around.
You, Corey Shockey, first of all, if there's anything you'd like to say in response, but then I do want to ask you the question: what is your view of what the Trump? Obviously, there's a lot. There's a moment of opportunity, but it's also a moment of crisis and war in the Middle East. What is your view of what the U.S. policy under Donald Trump should be with respect to Iran?
Well, irrespective of what I think it should be, what I think, as Dan says, the best guide to what administration policy is going to be is what the president said, president-elect said. And President-elect Trump sees the opportunity to push, to restore the maximum pressure policy against Iran. And given the successes Israel has had in puncturing the strategic depth that Iran thought it had bought itself by funding proxy terrorist organizations, and Iran's choices of attacking Israel's territory and population, I think there's going to be a world of opportunity to drive up the pressure on the Iranian government, which is already struggling with a crisis of legitimacy, even before you get to the potential for the supreme leader to need to have a successor, which he does not have an heir apparent that has the support either of the clerics or of the broader Iranian population. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for driving back Iranian influence, and not just their nuclear program, but their support for terrorism, their destabilization of regional governments, their interdiction or threat to shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, and their human rights abuses domestically. And given what President Trump has said, I think that you will see lots of creative diplomacy and lots of economic and potentially even military uses in order to further constrain Iran's malign influence.
Dan, would you like to add to that before we come to Natalie Porter for the first question?
Yes. Yes. I mean, President Trump and Senator Vance were very vocal about Iranian aggression during the campaign and were critical of some of the Biden administration's policies. What I would just add, though, is, you know, Corey brought up creative diplomacy, is that the president has also been clear about, you know, three things. Is one, he does not want, and so does Senator Vance, regime change. He was pushed, you know, to support, you know, restoring the Shah and whatnot, and he very clearly said we're not looking to do regime change in Iran. He also, and both him and Senator Vance also made clear that they do not want a direct conflict with Iran. They do not want another major war in the Middle East. And that is all in pursuit of, again, a larger deal that the president wants. And there were some, even after, pulling out of the JCPOA, there were efforts by the president himself to try and pursue that. They were undermined, and I'm not, speculating here. They both have bragged about it in various ways, by John Bolton and by Mike Pompeo. And I also know too is that Elon Musk met with the Iranian mission in New York, mission to the United Nations. What was discussed and whatnot's not known, but I think there is a clear desire here that differentiates, I think, President Trump and Senator Vance from others in the Republican Party who want to see a regime change and essentially another quasi, effort to build a liberal democracy in Iran, by many. So he's been pretty clear on both those points.
Thank you. Corey, please.
Yeah, can I just say one quick thing, which is there's a lot of space between forcing regime change in Iran and affecting the behavior of the Iranian government. And President Trump, in his prior term, both with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and with the attack on Syrians and Russian mercenaries in Syria, demonstrated a lot of risk tolerance in order to create positive change. And I think that may come in handy next round.
Thank you. Natalie Porter, we'll come to you next.
Hello, can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Hi, thank you. It's been really interesting. I'm Natalie. I was wondering if any of the panelists foresee any foreign policy implications relating to the Trump administration's tariff proposals on Mexico and Canada. There's been a lot of talk about the domestic implications, but I was wondering if there's any foreign policy potentially. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to take?
There are terrible foreign policy implications, which is we need the cooperation of Mexico to manage effectively the immigration across America's southern border. And so that's one potential. If the Mexican government fails to see us as a partner in their own prosperity and political stability, that makes managing immigration much more difficult. Second problem is that the opportunity to cement economic cooperation across North America, that is Canada, the US, and Mexico, is essential to get the economy of scale to manage China. And what we have seen is the diversion of supply chains that used to run through China, beginning to run through Mexico, and to a lesser extent, Canada. And the tariff threats, if they impede that, will make managing China much more difficult.
Thank you. Dan, would you like to add to that?
Yes, I would say is that, again, not just speaking for president or any of his team, I think that how they are framing it is essentially to try and get Canada and Mexico to cooperate more fulsomely on several issues, one of which Corey alluded to is on dealing with immigration and also on the fentanyl issue as well too, because that's how they're ultimately viewing the tariffs. I think the president has a much different view of tariffs than his predecessors, particularly over, I'd say the last, really in the post-World War II era. But I think that they are a means to an end, not an end of themselves. And whether or not it plays out the way that they're hoping remains to be seen. But I think that's an important kind of insight into how they approach it. The one thing I'd also say too is, this is, I'm not an economist, but one of the more, I think alongside foreign policy, one of the more interesting debates that is playing out in the Republican Party is not just the debate over foreign policy, but an economic policy as well too. And it has to do with a lot of the realignment around certain types of voters and other things like that. And I that's one of the more interesting debates playing out. And I think it's reflected not just in this debate around tariffs, but you could see it also playing out And this also may impact some of the defense spending stuff that we've been talking about over the renewal of the Trump tax cuts. The Tax Cuts Jobs Act of 2017 is that they're up for renewal this year, and there's going to be debate on how they renew them, whether they just renew them, cleanly, whether they focus more on things like a child tax credit. They only renew them for certain tax brackets. I think combined with the tariff discussion, that's going to be revealing about where the Republican Party is heading on the economic front.
Thank you. So much to say about that, and I'm really appreciative of those answers. Ramananda Sengupta, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay. If you unmute and ask your question.
No, I have actually a question each, if that's not a problem.
Please.
I wanted to ask Dan that, given what do you think Trump's policy vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific is going to, is it going to be a very changed policy from what we have now? I mean, do you see any dramatic changes in the US policy towards the Indo-Pacific? That's my question for you. And my question for Dr. Shaki is that, the current Quad, I think India has suggested that it be upgraded to a Quad Plus. I think that you have 4 other countries from the region jamming in. Now, is that going to augment or dilute the Quad's original purpose?
Dan, we'll come to you.
Dan first, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that question.
Yes. So in regards to the Indo-Pacific, I think that, so I actually think this is going to be a somewhat interesting area. And one thing that kind of, frustrates me about a lot of these debates is, people have to be put in these clean boxes. Like either somebody's a, China hawk or they're China dove, or, there's really no in between. And I think that, if you look at who President Trump is surrounding himself with, and we talk about like I talk about Senator Rubio in my piece and elsewhere about how his foreign policy views have evolved. And again, I don't want to sit here and pretend that Senator Rubio and I agree on every foreign policy issue, but he's clearly somebody who believes we need to be prioritizing the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific more over Europe and the Middle East. How you do that, I think there will be, debates within the administration and the party as a whole. But he's been pretty clear on that as well. And you have other people, like the nominee for Secretary of Defense, who said the similar things. I alluded to this earlier, is that, President Trump has not gone as far as others in the Republican Party and even in the Democrat Party in framing up the challenge of China as purely a military one, and particularly around the issue of making a hard commitment to defend Taiwan. You have not seen him. He's effectively maintained strategic ambiguity. And so I think that you will see more of an emphasis on building military power and military capabilities to potentially, God forbid, fight a war in the Pacific and to harden up allies. And you will see more of a true pivot that we really haven't accomplished, over the last 15 years or so, as I think some people hoped. But that does not mean that you will see certain policies being taken that would say some more hardcore China hawks would like to see. And again, whether it's strategic ambiguity or adopting kind of the global Cold War, the entirety of the global Cold War mindset vis-a-vis China. And I'd also just say too, is kind of going back to the first question, is there's also another interesting debate within the Republican Party about China, whether it's primarily an economic one or a military one. And there's a lot of people tying in the tariffs who believe that it is primarily an economic challenge. Therefore, we need to focus on the economic question. The military questions are secondary, and others view them as the same, or others primarily view it as a military challenge. And so that's another one of these debates going on below the surface, likely within the administration as well too, and Congress, that will be playing out, that will ultimately impact what types of policies will actually be implemented in the Indo-Pacific.
So on the Quad, I think it is likely to be the incoming administration's preferred multilateral organization, in part because it has fewer Europeans. And I think tensions with Europe and the ability of Europe to contribute meaningfully in the Pacific are going to be real challenges that the administration will pose. And second, because the desire to expand the Quad, for example, to include South Korea, I think is much less likely in a Trump administration for two reasons. First, because of the coup attempt in South Korea, which is going to both telegraph political instability in South Korea, but also almost certainly bring to power government and a set of advisors that are much less cooperative towards the United States and towards Japan. So the trilateral cooperation that the Biden administration worked so hard to establish between South Korea, Japan, and the US, I think is much less likely to be sustained for reasons principally to do with what's going on in South Korea. So South Korea's efforts to join the Quad and the G7, I think, become longer and longer shots because of the domestic politics in South Korea. And the second reason I think that the Quad will be the center of gravity is that my sense is that the efforts by the Trump administration in his first term to reduce military presence in South Korea and Japan, I think are likely to return, and the coup attempt in South Korea is likely to give momentum to that. So I think there will be also, a third reason is that President Trump and Prime Minister Modi seem to have a very good relationship, one that suits both of their domestic purposes. And so that too will work in favor of the Quad being a major, to the extent there is any multilateralism in a Trump administration, I think it's likely to happen through the Quad.
Very interesting. I will say that our team spent some time in Seoul talking about trilateral, the trilateral cooperation, and the recent developments do certainly seem to be driving, having the implications that you've just outlined. Alexander Scales, I just want to turn to you. I know you have a great question that you'd like to ask if you unmute.
Yes, thank you. Great discussion. And the panel's spoken a lot about defence spending today. And Andrew Mitchell recently quoted Defence Secretary Mattis in Parliament saying if you cut development spend, you have to order more ammunition. So my question is, what will international development look like under an incoming Trump presidency? And what will collaboration with the G7, G20 and the UN look like on, among other topics, open societies, democracy and human rights? Thank you.
So since Dan can't speak for the new administration, I will take a first swing at that, since I obviously don't speak for the new administration. But I think I already answered what cooperation in other international institutions will look like in a Trump administration, which is that the president-elect and the people closest to him see less value in multilateral fora than in bilateral or small group and less institutionalized settings. And I think that was their experience in the first term of the Trump administration. Second, while Secretary nominee Rubio may be an advocate, I'm not sure Dan would be better positioned than I to speak to Senator Rubio's views. I just don't think this is a moment where the American public is saying more development assistance to the world. That's what we elected the Trump administration for. So I think you should anticipate reduced development assistance, and as Britain has done in recent years, tying development assistance more tightly to your foreign policy priorities than has been the case in recent administrations.
Dan, I want to turn to you on this because, there is a lot of thinking and writing about, the argument that it's not just development assistance, it's providing an alternative to China's very extensive investments in the infrastructure needs of the global South, a term that, you know, people have a variety of feelings about, and that the US needs to compete on a level that comes, you know, that comes a little bit closer. It's a long way off right now, what China is doing. Do you have a view on this?
I would say that, in my view, you know, and I think this has a lot to do with how these programs have been managed and run, is that American economic development spending has almost rarely had the intended outcomes that we would like to see. I think that a lot of people think of the Marshall Plan and say, okay, well, we can replicate that in other parts of the world without kind of understanding, you know, the Marshall Plan itself and the implications of that and the why behind that. And it was you know, an example of using economic development, I think, successfully to help shore up the security position primarily in Western Europe. However, you know, in a lot of places, it has led to more corruption. It has empowered bad actors in certain countries, or has actually, in some cases, warped the economy and led to more poverty, more deprivation, and things like that. So the United States, just to be blunt, has been very bad at this. I am by no means an expert on Belt and Road. My understanding is that it is often the success of it has often been overhyped. There's been increasing concerns about the Chinese using it as a way to create debt bondage. And I think that they may be winding up in the same trap that the United States and in some ways the Soviet Union did, where they're building infrastructure and they're building systems and things that aren't long lasting and not solving some of the systemic issues that developing countries are dealing with. And I think, you know, if you look at Afghanistan and Iraq, those are primarily military, you know, operations, but there's a substantial development component to it. And in both cases, they largely were failures. And again, I think that mainly speaks to how we manage these programs, how we execute them. However, and you know, going back to the Mattis quote, I think he wasn't just talking about development assistance, but talking about resourcing diplomacy in general. And I you know, have a lot of respect for General Mattis as a Marine. It's kind of not, you know, I think as a defense secretary probably left a lot to be desired. But you know, in the case of resourcing diplomacy, is I think that's correct. The State Department has a lot of bloat and waste. I think there's plenty of places to cut and streamline, but you do want a robust diplomatic effort. And you do need to make sure that our diplomatic efforts always are taking precedent over military. And what I mean by that is our military option should always be the last resort. And so I actually don't think that the incoming Trump administration would disagree with that. But I do think Corey is largely right in her assessment that they will not be, you know, prioritizing engagement with some of these multilateral institutions and some of this development aid. And I just personally think they're right to be skeptical of them because they have not had a great track record in many cases.
So much in that last set of answers. We could not only on the question of efficiency of government, diplomacy, development. We are right at time. I promised you that we would end on time. You're both under a lot of pressure. I'm going to give you one final, very quick question that draws on the array of questions that we have left, and it's one for especially those of us in the UK and Europe. Can you, in closing, give us your succinct kernel of advice for the UK, for Europeans? How should they approach the next the transition, the next administration in particular? What do you think the top 2 or 3 priorities should be as they seek to forge a productive relationship with the United States going forward? I'm going to start with you, Corey, and then come to you, Dan, and then we'll wrap. Thank you so much.
I think follow the lead of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who both in the first Trump term and now is making a very strong case for transatlantic solidarity on the basis of Europe doing more of what the United States has been pleading for a very long time for Europe to do.
Thank you, Corey. That was right to the point. Thanks very much, Dan.
In addition, I would agree Europe needs to do more, but there's one other thing I would recommend. And that is I would avoid, the governments in particular need to avoid antagonizing not just the American right or the American conservative movement, but by weighing in and commenting or making threats around American policy that isn't tied to American security policy. And what I mean by that is I want to give a specific example. I actually think one of the most fundamental blunders that a lot of NATO and European governments at the time or outside of NATO who now are in made was criticizing the American Dobbs decision. I can tell you that working within the conservative movement, that was a turning point for a lot of conservatives, social conservatives, hadn't really paid a lot of attention to foreign policy, and coming out and criticizing that ruling, criticizing American gun laws and things like that is incredibly counterproductive and does not help create the type of grassroots support for maintaining a security relationship with Europe, which I support. I think it needs to be a lot of burden shifting, and we need to rethink America's positioning within NATO. But I do think we need to maintain some type of security relationship. But that becomes harder and harder when the Europeans are viewed as hostile to some of our domestic, beliefs and values and things like that. And I think it cuts both ways as well, too.
Thank you. Both very sharp and to the point. And it's been phenomenally useful to hear from both of you. There are some interesting points of overlap. There's a lot of diversity of perspective. The one thing is clearly true from both of you is a just deep base of knowledge and clarity of thought over both what's coming down the line and what should come down the line and what U.S. priorities will be and should be. And I am, on behalf of all of us, and especially my colleagues on the U.S. and Americas program who are sort of behind the scenes doing all the hard work, and Anar Bata, who is really could not do anything without her phenomenal colleague, Kanish, our fellow this year from the Schwartzman, supported by Steve Schwartzman and his foundation. Thanks to everybody, but especially thank you to our two speakers. We will be back very soon in the new year to continue these conversations. Have a wonderful break if we don't see you in person, and thanks so much.